A sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to Maison de Vrai, the city's most exclusive fashion boutique, the kind of place where dresses don't have price tags, and customers are offered champagne before being offered service. Cameras clicked in anticipation. Paparazzi shifted, readying lenses for the usual suspects. An actress, a billionaire's, but instead of any of those, the rear door opened slowly, and out stepped Aaliyah Clark. No designer logos, no bodyguards, no loud entourage, just a tall, poised black woman in a minimalist ivory dress that hugged her figure without shouting for attention. Her hair was wrapped in a silk scarf, and her only accessory was her presence, composed, intentional, and unmistakably powerful. She paused, taking in the towering glass facade of Maison de Vrai as if measuring it against her own standards. Then, with a calm exhale, she stepped forward. The doorman hesitated, just slightly, but it was enough. Inside, the air shifted. Subtle, but real. A woman clutching a crocodile. Birkin turned her head. A man in a Tom Ford blazer lowered his sunglasses. One sales associate elbowed another, whispering too loudly, "She's not a regular, is she? Maybe she's lost. Security on standby?" But Aaliyah didn't flinch. Her heels clicked against the marble like a metronome. Precise. Controlled. She walked not with arrogance, but with authority. Not with the desperation of someone trying to prove she belonged, but with the certainty of someone who knew she did. And that certainty? It made them uncomfortable. What none of them knew, or had bothered to check, was that this wasn't the first time Aaliyah Clark had stepped foot in Maison de Vrai. She had been here before, once welcomed, once doubted, once dismissed. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just browsing, she wasn't just making a point. This time, she was ready. And whether they liked it or not, they were about to find out exactly who she was. They wanted her gone. Politely at first, Genevieve's smile was brittle, strained, a thin veneer of professional courtesy that barely concealed the unease bubbling beneath the surface. The manager, who had been hovering just behind her, nodded stiffly, his gaze flicking to the security guard standing near the door, seeking reassurance. The room, once filled with the soft hum of luxury shopping, had shifted. It hummed now with whispers, hushed voices, and the subtle click of phone cameras being raised, as though everyone in the room could feel the atmosphere morphing from something mundane, a simple shopping trip, into something far more volatile. Aaliyah stood unmoving, her figure solid as granite, her presence the opposite of the nervous energy in the room. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, and there was something about her silence that made it clear she wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't intimidated. Her hands were still at her sides. The only sign of the tension she was feeling was in the slight clenching of her jaw. She wasn't afraid of them. She was daring them to act. Genevieve's voice broke the silence, its pitch rising with forced calm. "We're asking you politely to leave the premises." She took a step forward, but Aaliyah didn't flinch, not an inch. Aaliyah's smile was a quiet weapon, a smile without warmth, a smile that said, "I'm not the one in the wrong here." "Call the police," she said, her tone almost conversational, as if she were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "Let them remove me, on camera." The words hung in the air, heavy, like a gauntlet thrown at their feet. There was no mistaking it. Aaliyah wasn't making a request. She wasn't trying to de-escalate. She was challenging them. And they knew, with unsettling clarity, that she wasn't bluffing. Genevieve's polished exterior cracked just a little. Her eyes flickered nervously to the manager, then to the guard, and without another word, the decision was made. The quiet shuffle of murmurs swirled through the boutique, the crowd now sensing that something was shifting, but not in the way they had expected. Minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the boutique swung open with an almost theatrical grace, and two uniformed officers entered. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, leaving a path for them to walk. The soft click of camera shutters filled the space, the sound a sharp contrast to the muffled whispers that now seemed to grow louder, as though everyone knew they were witnessing something far more significant than a retail spat. Genevieve was already moving, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she rushed to intercept the officers, her voice tight with the thin veneer of authority she was clinging to. "She refused to leave," Genevieve said, her words rushed and brittle, her attempt to project control falling flat in the face of the officer's dispassionate gaze. Her authority, once unquestioned in the boutique's pristine corridors, seemed to disintegrate the moment she uttered those words. Aaliyah, still calm and composed, didn't let the tension of the moment rattle her. She didn't even glance at the officers as they moved toward her. Instead, she simply reached into her bag, pulled out her ID, and handed it over without hesitation, without even a flicker of uncertainty. The officer glanced down at the ID, his face still impassive, but as his eyes scanned the name on the card, something changed. His gaze lingered for a beat longer, his fingers running over the details with the faintest hint of recognition. "Aaliyah Clark," he said aloud, his voice noticeably softer now, a shift in tone that didn't go unnoticed. "Civil rights attorney, member of the city's Human Rights Council." The room, which had been buzzing with whispered judgment, seemed to hold its breath. The cameras, which had been rolling silently, now seemed to capture something far more profound than just an altercation in a boutique. The tension that had once been palpable now seemed to transform into something else, a reckoning. The crowd sensed it, their hushed murmurs now quieting as the weight of the moment sank in. The officer glanced at his partner, a silent exchange passing between them. They weren't dealing with an unruly customer anymore. They weren't dealing with someone they could easily dismiss or brush off. No. They were now facing someone with power, someone with influence, someone who mattered, not just in the legal world, but in the eyes of everyone in the room. The man who had been ready to remove her now seemed to shift his weight, looking to his partner for guidance. Aaliyah's smile didn't change. It was still that quiet, knowing smile, one that spoke volumes, a smile that told the officers, the boutique, and the entire room that this moment had already been decided. She had already won. She knew it. And soon, they would too. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the shift in power. The boutique, once a symbol of high society and privilege, now stood at the center of something far larger. The polished facade of luxury had cracked open, and the truth, ugly, undeniable, was leaking out for the world to see. This wasn't just a confrontation. It wasn't just a moment of personal triumph. This was a reckoning. And the stakes had just been raised. What had begun as a simple attempt to brush off a customer had escalated into a public declaration of accountability. The room was no longer a boutique. It was ground zero for change. The video exploded online. Within the first 12 hours, it had accumulated over 4 million views. The headline spread like wildfire. Black woman profiled in luxury boutique. But it wasn't just a viral moment. It was a movement. Social media erupted with hashtags and outcry, each tweet and post spreading like wildfire across platforms. The footage of Aaliyah, poised, calm, and unflinching in the face of blatant discrimination, became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the luxury retail world. People saw not just a single instance of bias, but the stark, ugly reality that this was how the system worked. It was a truth that had been long ignored but now laid bare for all to see. Celebrities, those who had once flaunted their designer purchases without a second thought, now shared the video, their voices amplifying Aaliyah's message. Some added their support directly, publicly denouncing the incident. Others merely reposted. But the message was universal. Something had to change. These influential figures, once untouchable in their privilege, now found themselves caught up in the tide of public outrage. The conversation was shifting, and they knew it was a conversation they needed to be part of. Activists, already on the front lines of the battle for racial equality, rallied behind Aaliyah. They saw the viral video not just as a singular event, but as a microcosm of a much larger issue that stretched far beyond this one boutique. This was the systemic inequality they had been fighting for years. They organized protests, held rallies, and began to demand justice, not just for what had happened to Aaliyah, but for the countless others who had been subjected to the same treatment in these exclusive high-end spaces. It wasn't just a moment for racial justice. It was a moment for social change on a global scale. By midnight, the pressure had become unbearable. Maison d'Oeuvre, once the epitome of high-end shopping and exclusivity, was forced to close its doors. The company scrambled to respond, issuing half-hearted apologies that only fueled the fire. Their luxury items, once symbols of status, had now become symbols of injustice. The very items that had been so coveted by their affluent clientele had now been tainted by the scandal, leaving the boutique scrambling to salvage its image. The high-rolling customers who had once frequented the store with smug satisfaction now found themselves caught in a whirlwind of shame. Their association with the boutique had become a mark of complicity in the system of racial exclusion, and the fallout was swift. It was a reality check, and no one, not even the store's most loyal patrons, could ignore it. But that was just the beginning. Aaliyah, meanwhile, didn't need the boutique's apology. She didn't need sympathy or hollow gestures of regret. She had already moved past all of that. She was already thinking several steps ahead. What the public didn't know, what they couldn't see in the viral video, was that Aaliyah wasn't just a lawyer. She was a strategist, a tactician who had spent over a year meticulously building a case against retail discrimination, piece by piece, quietly documenting the subtler, insidious acts of racism that went unnoticed by most. Every time she was turned away, every time she was given the cold shoulder, she documented it. Each slur, each dismissive glance, each accidental oversight was recorded, like evidence in a growing case. Whether it was the refusal to allow her to try on clothes, the unspoken assumption that she couldn't afford them, or the condescending tone employees used when interacting with her, Aaliyah made sure it didn't go unnoticed. She gathered receipts, compiled witness statements, and even recorded phone calls with managers, all quietly building a case that would eventually explode into the public eye. Now, with the video going viral, Aaliyah had the one thing that money couldn't buy: proof. The footage of her calmly standing her ground in the face of the boutique's attempts to push her out was undeniable. It wasn't edited. It wasn't taken out of context. It was real-time, raw evidence, captured live, showing the prejudice and discrimination that had been allowed to fester in luxury retail for far too long. And it wasn't just a he said, she said situation. It was proof, irrefutable, public, and damning. And it was more than enough to hold Maison d'Ivray accountable. Aaliyah didn't need to argue her point anymore. The world had already seen it. The video, the public outcry, the support. It all spoke for itself. Now she was no longer just reacting to an injustice. She was making sure it would never happen again. Armed with the proof, she was ready to take on the retail industry, one lawsuit at a time. No longer would people of color be made to feel like they didn't belong in spaces where wealth and status collided. No longer would they be treated like outsiders in stores that were supposed to be places of luxury for everyone. Aaliyah wasn't just exposing the problem, she was dismantling it. And the battle was far from over. The fight was just beginning, and the world was watching closely. Aaliyah Clark had turned the tables. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or denied a place at the table. She was fighting for a world where access to luxury, dignity, and respect wasn't determined by the color of your skin. And she had just started. Aaliyah filed her lawsuit, not just against Maison d'Ivray, but against 5 other elite boutiques that had long operated under the illusion of exclusivity and impeccable service. The case wasn't just about a single instance of racial profiling. It was about an entire system, one built on discrimination, exclusion, and the commodification of privilege. The lawsuit hit like a shockwave, but it wasn't the only wave that followed. As the case gained traction, more stories began to pour in. People who had once stayed silent, who had been taught to endure the microaggressions and subtle slights, now found the courage to speak up. Latinas shared tales of being asked to prepay for goods, while their white counterparts were offered the option to charge their purchases without question. Asians were told, this might be out of your price range, even when they were only looking to try on items, never mind purchase them. Then there were the black teens, often treated as though they were invisible until they were followed through the aisles by store security, their every move scrutinized as though they were criminals by default. Aaliyah turned this silence into testimony. Every email, every phone call, every social media post became part of the larger narrative. She gathered these stories with the precision of a lawyer, but also with the empathy of someone who understood all too well what it felt like to be marginalized in these spaces. Each new account wasn't just another piece of evidence. It was another person reclaiming their voice, reclaiming their dignity. And Aaliyah didn't just collect these stories, she shared them. She amplified them. She knew that shame, when used properly, could be turned into the most potent weapon. Where once these stories had been whispered in hushed tones or buried under the weight of embarrassment, they now had a platform. They became undeniable, irrefutable evidence that Maison d'Ivray and its peers were part of a larger, systemic problem. Fashion's flawless facade had cracked. What was once seen as the height of sophistication and privilege now appeared as a brittle mask, chipped and fractured under the pressure of truth. The carefully curated images of perfection, perfectly styled mannequins, pristine boutique interiors, and flawless customer service now seemed like hollow shells built to hide the ugliness within. And with every story shared, every lawsuit filed, the truth began to leak out. Slowly at first, then all at once. The cracks widened. The comfortable lies started to crumble. No longer could the fashion world pretend it was a space for all people, regardless of their race or background. No longer could they shield themselves behind a veil of exclusivity. Aaliyah wasn't just taking down one boutique. She was taking down an entire industry, and the world was watching. The boutique issued an apology. It was carefully worded, almost rehearsed, a well-practiced public relations attempt to mitigate the damage. The statement seemed less genuine and more like an obligation, written to placate the growing outrage. Maison de Vray fired the staff members involved, those who had either directly participated in the incident or had turned a blind eye to it. They promised diversity training and made vague commitments to change. It was all part of the damage control playbook, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The public's perception of the brand had been irrevocably shattered. They had become the face of a much deeper, more insidious problem, one that wasn't confined to a single boutique or a singular incident. Maison de Vray wasn't just an isolated case of poor customer service. It was a reflection of a larger issue that had festered in the fashion industry for decades. The discrimination that Aaliyah had exposed wasn't simply a result of a few bad employees. It was systemic. It was embedded in the very fabric of how luxury fashion operated, from the way its clientele was curated and treated to the hidden biases that permeated every corner of the retail experience. Aaliyah didn't seek revenge. That was never her goal. She wasn't out for personal satisfaction or to dismantle a single boutique. It wasn't about punishing them for the sake of it. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was to ensure that this kind of behavior, this type of exclusion, would never be tolerated again. She wasn't focused on temporary victories. Instead, she demanded reform, real structural change that would go beyond one boutique, one apology, or one moment in time. She wanted to challenge the very system that allowed discrimination to thrive in the first place. And she got it. Her case became a landmark moment in the fight for racial equality in retail. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a catalyst for change. The case reshaped policies in the luxury sector, forcing major boutiques to reconsider how they interacted with their customers. From diversity and anti-bias training to new guidelines for how staff should handle people from all backgrounds, the industry had no choice but to reevaluate its practices. It was no longer acceptable to turn a blind eye to the discrimination that had been woven into the fabric of high-end retail. Aaliyah's battle had made it impossible to ignore. In the wake of her victory, laws were introduced in cities across the country to ensure that retail discrimination, in all its forms, would be met with serious consequences. No longer could boutiques hide behind the shield of exclusivity to justify treating people poorly. The case sparked a national debate on privilege, race, and access in high-end retail. Public figures, politicians, and everyday consumers alike began questioning what exclusivity really meant. Was it a sign of privilege and wealth? Or was it just a euphemism for exclusion, a way to perpetuate class and racial divides under the guise of luxury? The conversation that Aaliyah started spread far beyond the confines of luxury shopping, touching on broader issues of privilege and systemic bias in society. But perhaps the most powerful impact of Aaliyah's fight was that it gave a voice to thousands of people who had experienced the same type of discrimination in silence. For years, many had quietly endured the humiliation of being treated as second-class customers, dismissed or ignored because of their race, their background, or their perceived economic status. But now, after Aaliyah's public stand, those voices could no longer be silenced. Her courage gave them the strength to speak out, to share their stories, and to demand better. They no longer had to suffer in silence. People who had once felt powerless in the face of elite, high-fashion establishments now knew they didn't have to accept the role of being marginalized customers in spaces that were supposed to cater to all. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one who looks rich. It's the one who knows their worth. Aaliyah Clark didn't just win a lawsuit. She didn't just expose one boutique's discriminatory practices. She changed the way an entire industry saw the world. She reminded people that true power doesn't lie in wealth or status, but in the ability to stand up for what's right, no matter the odds. And in doing so, she redefined what it meant to be powerful, not by your bank account, but by your principles. Her case wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for every person who had been overlooked, underestimated, and ignored. For every person who had been told they didn't belong. She had turned the tables on an entire industry. And in doing so, Aaliyah Clark showed the world that when you know your worth, you have the power to change everything.